Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. My name is Fred Varco, a member of the Professional Activities Committee. Before we start, can I ask you to turn your telephones off or to stun? Thank you. Very pleased to have our guest, James Heenan, from the, get it right, Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Seoul, which is mainly concerned with, or almost exclusively concerned with, human rights in North Korea. James has worked in Cambodia and an extended period in Palestine in the past, so he's used to difficult jobs. We'll have a short speech, and then we'll have questions and answers. So over to you, James. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Fred. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks to the FCCJ, excuse me, for hosting the event. As Fred said, I'm the head of the UN Human Rights Office. We're based in Seoul in the Republic of Korea. Our office has been there since 2015 after the report, or following the report of the UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in the DPRK, the Democratic Republic of Korea. We're based in Seoul for a number of reasons. One of them is that the mandate given to us by the international community is not recognized by the DPRK. What is that mandate? What do we do? We are mandated to monitor, document, analyze, and publicly report on the human rights situation in the DPRK. We're mandated to, as we say, look for pathways towards accountability for serious violations of human rights as well as crimes against humanity, which were identified by the Commission of Inquiry 10 years ago. We're mandated to maintain a central repository, which is essentially a database of information on human rights in the DPRK that can be used for future accountability purposes. We have legal experts who help us with all of that. And we also, importantly, have consultations, particularly with victims, to see exactly what they want in terms of accountability for these long-standing, widespread violations and even crimes that are happening in DPRK. We also obviously raise awareness of the human rights situation there, which is why we're here this morning. We publish a number of reports every year that you can find. We published one 2 weeks ago. We launched in Seoul, this one on forced disappearances in and by the DPRK. I think you have a QR code that will give you access immediately to our website, but you can find it on our website as well as our headquarters website in Geneva. We're in Japan. I'm here with my colleagues on a mission for a week. The mission is linked to the issue of abductions of Japanese nationals by the DPRK. The Commission of Inquiry that I mentioned before concluded that the systematic and widespread abductions and enforced disappearances conducted by DPRK amount to crimes against humanity. And due to the long-standing and number of these enforced disappearances, it's a priority area of work for our office. What we try to do in this report is to document the story of enforced disappearances and abductions, but also to give a voice to victims. The organisation is victim-centred, and we try to make sure that the voice of victims about what happened to them, the impact and what they want is made as clear publicly as possible. We rely on various sources of information, but mainly talking to victims. And the name of the report is These Wounds Do Not Heal. We'd thought about calling it No Time to Wait, because as sure as everyone in the room here knows, the age of abductees and their families is ever advancing, as it is for all of us, but that is a clock that's ticking. We've already lost, for example, the father of Ms. Megumi 3 years ago now. It's just a reminder that these people need justice in their lifetimes. As you'll know, the government of Japan has officially recognised 17 nationals as having been abducted by DPRK, but it is also investigating 871 cases of missing persons in Japan where the possibility of abduction by the DPRK cannot be ruled out. Mainly back in the 1970s and 80s, these people were abducted from Japan by DPRK, and we had a series of events where there seemed to be progress. In 2002, we had Kim Jong-il admitting the abduction, which is, I think, one of the very rare times, maybe the only time, that DPRK has admitted to serious human rights violations, in this case crimes, when the then Japanese Prime Minister visited Pyongyang. DPRK confirmed it would take appropriate measures, however, and while some were returned, DPRK claimed that the others had died. The information provided by DPRK was not plausible. So at the moment, of the 17 Japanese people that the government recognises as abducted, 12 remain disappeared, 5 were returned. And as I mentioned, we have these other cases which are still under investigation. The report itself covers all forms of enforced disappearance by DPRK, and as I said, it's important to note that in the case of Japan, DPRK has admitted what's happened. The report puts the victim's perspective front and centre. I won't read out some of the quotes, but they're there for you to use. But one, Ms. Taguchi Yako was abducted back in 1978, and her brother, who also passed away 2 years ago, had said to the COI, "I really want to know the whereabouts of her, and also whether she is healthy or sick. I really want to see her photos. I really wish to have her photo." I think what we need to do is to get those voices of victims out to sort of show the searing pain that these crimes produce. We can talk about them in very dispassionate sort of legal terms, but I think it's incredibly important that people understand what this means for victims and their families. To that end, it's important, and part of our mission here has been to talk about this, to understand the international legal framework on enforced disappearances. And there's just a couple of points I want to make. One is that it is a continuing violation. It does not end until the whereabouts of the person is established. The second is that while the person who's abducted is clearly a victim, their families who endure the pain are also seen under international law as victims, and that means they have rights such as the right to know, the right to reparation, and so forth. In fact, the UN Human Rights Committee in Geneva has said that the pain and suffering experienced by families of disappeared persons can, in some cases, amount to torture or inhuman treatment. The report also deals briefly with the Paradise on Earth campaign, which was a campaign from the 50s to the 80s in which tens of thousands of people were enticed to move to DPRK on what turned out to be false promises. While this is a complex situation involving many, many people, it cannot be ruled out that some of the people who went to North Korea, and we don't know what happened to them, some of them could qualify as victims of enforced disappearances, as I said, where we don't know what happened to them. For many of them, we know where they are, but for some of them, we don't know what happened to them. Amongst these, I mean, not all of them, but in terms of numbers, for example, we had 6,836 Japanese wives and children that went to the DPRK under this program. They were deceived to believe that they could come back to Japan and communicate with relatives here. We've met with several who've given us testimony on this. One woman said that her mother left the 2 children here in Japan and thought she could, of course, come back, and she never came back. Many of those who went to the north were also sent to political prison camps. We know that. There's a number of recommendations in the report which I can talk about if there's an interest, but clearly one of the things is the right to truth aspect, asking DPRK to acknowledge what happened and to acknowledge what happened, the fate of these people, ideally to provide the remains of those who have died as well, and of course the return of those who are still living. If I might, Fred, just talk very briefly about the current human rights situation in DPRK.
Yeah.
While enforced disappearance is still a priority issue in dealing with the DPRK, there are, of course, many other issues happening there. The Commission of Inquiry that I mentioned earlier concluded that there were reasonable grounds to believe that crimes against humanity had been and continued to be committed in DPRK, and that situation has not changed as far as we are aware, according to our information. The key thing that's happened recently is the closure at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. North Korea is now, DPRK is now more closed than ever. That has had a number of impacts. One is that the number of people escaping North Korea has dwindled from around 1,000 a year to I think last year was 67. That's the number of people escaping and arriving in the Republic of Korea. We know that what that's resulted in is that a number of the people who are arriving in the Republic of Korea haven't been in DPRK for quite a long time. They've been in China, or they are foreign workers sent by DPRK to work abroad in restaurants or whatever, as we know, and they have then escaped and come to the Republic of Korea. Those foreign workers have a very different sort of profile to what we normally see in escapees. Escapees are often women who are traders near the Chinese border who go across and continue, or women who are trafficked. In fact, in the past, the escapees we interviewed were 80% women. Now, because of this change, we have many more men, and they're men generally coming from Pyongyang, from a higher level of the society. That gives us a lot of information about forced labour and overseas work, where we have information about these individuals sent abroad to do quite arduous and dangerous work, and often for very long hours. I interviewed someone who says she had one Sunday off a month, and this is abroad, this is not even in DPRK. What else is going on in there? We know that there are severe restrictions on the right to movement. We know that the border with China has been fortified. We know there's severe restrictions on freedom of information. The government has enacted the anti-reactionary thought law, which essentially prohibits the distribution or viewing of anything, drawings, photos, films, anything, particularly from the Republic of Korea, which is seen to be against the national interest. We know that there is now the use of lethal force, or lethal force is prescribed for those who try to cross the border. The food situation, which we get asked about a lot, it is difficult to verify, but even from the information we have, we know there are challenges with access to food in some parts of the country. I don't think we can say it's a widespread phenomena that we had in the 1990s, but certainly there are challenges in some parts of the country, and the government has, in its own way, almost admitted this, that there are issues about food distribution in certain provinces. The same with medical treatment. We see that the access to medical treatment, well, the services and the materials are extremely scarce. The final thing I'll mention is that we try to have a gender lens on the work we do, and the issue of the impact of all of this, particularly on women, is something we're understanding more and more. Women in detention, for example, women are not provided with the protection they need. For example, pregnant women in detention are not provided with the protection they need. Women are subject to very invasive and humiliating searches, both when they go into detention, when they're brought back across the border, if they're sent back, and so forth. This is an area that has not been highlighted enough. Women have a peculiar role in North Korea. Often men have a state-assigned job, and they have to turn up to that job, allowing women a little bit more leeway on what they freedom in their lives. But on the other hand, we have, for example, a very seemingly accepted high rate of violence against women, particularly in the home. The sense is that it's a private matter, and it may be one of the biggest impacts on women in the country is the rate of violence against women, domestic violence. That's all I'll say for now, Fred, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Okay, thank you very much. So we'll go to questions and answers. If you have a question, please raise your hand, come up to the microphone, state your name and affiliation, and keep the questions as short as possible, please. Any volunteers? Okay, I'll go with the first one. What you might term the elephant in the room, China. A lot of the escapees, if not most of them, come through China, which doesn't have a great human rights record of its own. And whether or not that's it's sort of state-sponsored human rights offences or local people, getting out of North Korea is only half the problem, right? Getting them out of China is probably another problem. And certainly there are human rights abuses in that area of China where they escape. And some of them obviously are repatriated or put back. Do you have to deal with that, or do you talk to people about what's going on in that area? And do you consult with the Chinese government?
So essentially, it's not the sole route out of DPRK, but it is by far the major route. We have had people crossing by fishing boats, even crossing the DMZ, incredibly dangerous, or some apparently into Russia, but by far the most go through China. What we know from the people we interview, and many of them have taken that route, is that it is truly arduous, moving into China, being illegal there, and then moving down to another country, generally in Southeast Asia, before coming back. We've heard of the hardships of that journey. The issue of repatriation is probably the top issue because, no, I shouldn't say the top issue, one of the two top issues. So repatriation is one. The High Commissioner has raised publicly and consistently the concern that there may be refoulement happening, which is where people are sent back to, people are fleeing persecution and are sent back, well, either fleeing persecution or they are being sent back to potentially unfair trials and at worst the death penalty. And we know that that does happen in some cases. The position of the People's Republic of China is very clear. They say these people are illegal migrants, they're economic migrants, and it's not a scenario that fits within the refugee framework. We continue to push this position that it needs a lot more analysis to see whether there is a refoulement issue here. And the information we're getting from people who have escaped and then being sent back and then often escaped again is that return to North Korea will have significant negative consequences for the individual. Now, obviously, they've escaped again, so we're not saying that everyone who is sent back is sent to a political prison camp for the rest of their lives or are executed. That depends on many other factors that we can talk about. But certainly there will be cases where people are sent back to extreme forms of punishment. We've raised this issue with China, and that's their position. Sorry, I said there were two issues. The second issue is just the humanitarian needs of those people while they are in China, particularly of women and children. Yeah, if you are essentially hiding or you're scared of being sent back, and you have children with you, for example. International law is very clear that those children and women in that situation have special protections, and we are urging that those special protections be respected.
Can I just ask, what kind of conversations do you have with the Chinese government? I mean, it's clearly a human rights issue in that part of the country. Do they deny it's a human rights issue? And is there any kind of progress that they
Well, I mean, these conversations are done not with me in Seoul. They're done at a higher level. But as I said, the issue that we've identified and raised is the issue of non-refoulement, and it's not just us. Yeah, I mean, it's in the public reports. There's a differing view. There's a view that that these people are not asylum seekers or whatever, that it is an issue of economic migrants. And I would say, just to be fair, that it's not only China that has this argument these days. There are other countries that say, no, these people are economic migrants. But we have a view based on the information we've received that, as I said before, that many of these people would be sent back to either at least unfair trials or extremely harsh punishment.
Okay. Any questions from the floor? Raise your hand if you have a question. Very quiet people. Okay, we have a question from David McNeil of the Irish Times. He states two questions. In your view, does putting pressure on North Korea to improve its human rights work, and maybe I could supplement that by saying what kind of pressure would you put on North Korea? And what sort of access does North Korea allow to human rights monitors? I just have a note here that North Korea has actually signed some human rights treaties, but presumably they're not being enforced, to say the least.
Okay, second question is easy. No one has access at the moment. No one. Not even North Korean diplomats outside North Korea have access to North Korea. In normal times, no, there's not much, well, there's minimal access for those working on human rights. But this is where we come back to the first question. The Democratic Republic of Korea is a UN member state. Like all other UN member states, they're bound by the Charter and by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They have also ratified 5 human rights conventions. They report under those conventions to the committees in Geneva that monitor those conventions. The reporting is not in any way up to date, but that's also the case for many countries. There has been DPRK participates in other mechanisms, a universal periodic review, which all member states go through. They participate in the Sustainable Development Goal process. So there's certainly engagement on those issues and on human rights issues. DPRK does not say, no, we don't agree with this human rights framework. They agree with it. They say that they are that the problems that organisations like us are highlighting are overblown or false, and that they also have their own view of human rights, which is based in their form of government. There has been, in fact, a special rapporteur in the UN human rights system. We have independent experts who are tasked to work on specific issues, and the special rapporteur on the rights of persons with disability visited Pyongyang. Well, in fact, visited DPRK about 5 years ago now. So it's not unheard of. It's not. And I think that's important because that's where progress will come. I think the government, like every government, is very concerned about its human rights reputation. We see that everywhere, and in my experience, fairly long experience, DPRK is the same. Everything we say, everything we put out, we get a response, a public response. It's not the response we necessarily would like, but we certainly get a response. So putting pressure, sorry, back to the question, which was, does putting pressure on DPRK on human rights work? We think it does. I mean, human rights has both an instrumental and an intrinsic value. You push it because you have to push it because it's human rights. You don't need a reason to push for human rights. The fact that it's human rights is enough to push it. But instrumentally, we think it also does make a difference, particularly in DPRK. It does lead to behaviour change. We have heard anecdotally that after the Commission of Inquiry that I spoke about previously published its seminal report, there were changes. There were changes particularly in ill treatment in detention. Maybe modest, maybe minimal, but at least there was change. That also supports the idea that they are very susceptible to that story. I would even go as far as to say that as a member state of the United Nations, as all member states are very jealous of their sovereignty and want to be at the table with other member states. And while the peace and security and non-proliferation table is a key table, these days, human rights is a key table.
Okay. We have a question from Martin culling of Handelsblatt newspaper, and it's kind of related. It's basically down to the carrot or the stick. And he asks, how can governments pressure or incentivize North Korea to solve these issues?
Yeah, that's the key question, isn't it? I mean, I don't want to normalise the extreme situation of North Korea, but that's the question in many contexts at the moment. The stick is what is being used. It's not the right word, but the sort of the push for accountability is what the international community has really pushed for, and that's the mandate of our office, to work out ways to hold to account people who have been responsible for these crimes against humanity in North Korea for decades. Yeah. And that's linked to, well, how realistic is that? Now, the options for accountability, if you want to call it the stick, I don't like that word, but the options for accountability are the International Criminal Court. This is what the Commission of Inquiry said, and they specifically said, refer the case. That's unlikely to happen in the current geopolitical context. We could set up an ad hoc tribunal like we had in Yugoslavia or in other places, Cambodia. That's also because of certain things, difficult to see an agreement being reached on that these days. Also because the ICC was intended to do away with all those ad hoc ones and have it in one place. What we're looking for is, the other option is universal jurisdiction, meaning member states, including the ROK in Japan, who have the ability to prosecute people and who have victims on their territory, moving ahead with those prosecutions. I think that process, which is certainly moving, is effective. And we also need to remember that things have changed so much in the last 10 years since the Commission of Inquiry report came out. The idea of international justice is now much more embedded, much more normalised in the global consciousness. Yeah, so it's not an idle threat anymore. Let me put it that way. The carrot engagement is always there. We take a two-track approach. Even if DPRK won't talk to us in Seoul, they talk to the UN and to our colleagues at headquarters. There is a desire there, we understand, to understand the human rights language and mechanisms better. Yeah. Now, some people might say, well, that's just to subvert them or to whatever. I don't care. Knowledge is fungible. You can give people knowledge, they can use it for all sorts of reasons, but you give them the knowledge. So we do see engagement. We did see some moves on engagement on the human rights issues. For example, disability. I mentioned disability. And we know that on issues such as disability and to an extent the rights of women and children, there is a desire to engage. All of that has been unfortunately sidetracked by the COVID closure because it's harder to engage on anything. But as we always say, it has to be a two-track approach on DPRK and almost pretty well every other human rights crisis in the world today.
So, I just want you to clarify what your office does or concentrates on in terms of either accountability is one side, but effecting change must be highly important as well. Which is more important, accountability for what they've done or changing what they're doing?
No, we see it differently. It's not accountability or change. Improvement is the goal. And the two ways you can do that is to engage and to encourage and cajole. The other way is to encourage behaviour change through accountability. Because as we know at the national level, the way in which you encourage behaviour change is to threaten people, not threaten people, but to the risk of prosecution, yeah? So no, it's the two tracks towards the one thing, which is behaviour change.
Okay, and just going back to what you were saying about having a lack of direct contact, I'm not quite sure how many embassies there are now in Pyongyang, but I know the UK did have an embassy. Are you in touch with these embassies in Pyongyang, Western embassies?
At the moment, there are no Western diplomats in Pyongyang. There are about 45 foreigners, I think, in North Korea. The Chinese ambassador is moving back there. Some other countries' ambassadors never left. But no, there's no. My colleagues in the United Nations agencies, UNICEF, UNDP, and others are all out of the country as well. So there's no one there. In normal times we're in touch, but no, there's no one there at the moment.
Okay. Any questions from the journalists here? Okay. It'll be up to me again. Kidnappings. In Japan, we've had a lot of publicity about the kidnappings of the Japanese, but most of the kidnappings really occurred from South Korea rather than Japan. Is that another important aspect of your work, and do you have a lot of contact with people who were kidnapped from South Korea rather than Japan?
Yeah, so the phenomenon of enforced disappearance, and I keep using that word because that's the legal framework we use, but kidnapping, abduction, so forth. Our work on enforced disappearance looks at all forms. There's a number of different types, or how shall I say, typologies, of enforced disappearance. We've talked about the abductions from Japan, which were very serious. It was, one state interfering in another state, just turning up and kidnapping nationals. But we also had, on the peninsula, we had individuals POWs not sent back after the war. We also had individuals kidnapped from the south by the north, particularly fishermen. We had, we even had, we had an airliner that was hijacked and brought to Pyongyang, and many of those people disappeared. I mean, the key thing is that you don't know their fate. That's the key. If you know where the people are and what's happening, if DPRK says, yes, they're in this prison, this is where they are, this is their number, that's not an enforced disappearance, yeah? It's the lack of knowledge of the fate. We had, even going way back, we had civilians kidnapped, taken by the North when, as they retreated during the various waves of the Korean War. Thousands of people were taken to the North. What's interesting for me is that normally in a country, enforced disappearance is used to spread terror amongst a population. We see that in many places. It's to terrify a province or an opposition stronghold. That's where it started from in World War II. I can't remember the word, but we'll get to it. Nebel and Nachennebel in Germany. So you need to. But in this case, it's not clear that it was to spread terror. It was to grab people, in many cases, who had skills that were useful for DPRK. Linguistic skills, Japanese linguistic skills, Japanese passports, professors from the South. So that's something that I think actually provides a direct link between human rights violations and the peace and security situation at the moment, the fact that the enforced disappearances are actually designed to strengthen the state. Okay.
So do you interview a lot of people who, for example, were kidnapped a long time ago, or is that not part of your mandate at the moment?
We've interviewed more than 500 people, and in-depth interviews. And some of them are people who were forcibly disappeared and somehow returned, as happened here in Japan, or others who were family members. And here this week we've interviewed a number of family members of Japanese abductees. Yeah.
Okay, another question from Martin Curling of Handelsblatt newspaper in Germany. And he asks, can you talk a bit more on domestic violence against women? Presumably in...
Sure. So earlier this year, there's an important report put out by the Special Rapporteur on the DPRK, who is an independent expert working for the UN, Professor Salmon. And she focused quite a bit on this issue. The evidence we have is that there's problems at every level. First of all, the legal framework. The legal framework is not at all sufficient to protect women and to criminalise violence against women, including intimate partner violence. The information we have from people who have come from North Korea is that it is normalised. It is entirely seen as private behaviour, and the police do not get involved, such that we are where we were in many countries in the past, the sense that it was a normal part of an intimate relationship that the man would be able to be violent against the wife, and the wife would accept it or even see it as being her fault in some way. It's really, in some ways, I think it's fair to say, a bit of a mirror of what we've seen in many societies in the past. But what's interesting is that it's just one of these issues which has not had a spotlight shone on it at all. And part of the reason is because we don't have access. But this information that we're getting through, together with the laws that are publicly promulgated, we can get allow for that sort of analysis now.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is also possibly Confucianism, which, and you know, in Korean society, the men traditionally have been, if you like, superior to women, and that's changed a lot, obviously, now, I think both in North and South Korea. But maybe that was part of the problem to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of a society where men weren't superior to women, but yes, seen as superior to women, sorry.
Right. Martin also asked, North Koreans also have some kind of smartphones. What is happening in North Korea regarding digital surveillance? What technologies and methods are used for surveillance?
Well, what we know is that North Koreans aren't connected to the internet. They have a hermetically sealed national internet. The use of mobile phones and the use of, well, slightly smartphones, if you can say that, has risen dramatically. I've seen figures on that. I don't have them with me. That allows a form of surveillance. I'm not sure how sophisticated it is, because we have evidence, or we have information from those we interview that, you know, police can come and demand to look at your phone to see the videos that you have on your phone, to see if you have any particularly South Korean content on your phone. So I'm not an expert, but that would suggest that it can't be accessed remotely as a form of monitoring. But as I said, I'm not an expert on that. But we know that in order in order to use the phones are only useful for the control comes from the fact that the phones are only useful for very basic functions, essentially, without the internet and so forth.
Okay. Sorry, any more questions from the floor? You have a question? Okay. In Japan, can you just tell us a bit more about what you've done in Japan, and have you had talks with the Japanese government?
Yes, so we've been here. We've spoken to the government, to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and others, and obviously the abduction headquarters in the Cabinet Secretary's office. We've spoken with victims. We've interviewed victims, and when I say victims, as I said before, that includes families of the Japanese abductees. And their lawyers we've spoken to, because there's some litigation happening here. We've also spoken to the civil society organisations that work intensively, including those working with those people who haven't been officially recognised but are still under investigation for being possibly abducted, the larger number I gave at the beginning, the 871. And we've spoken with a number of academics, because there's a lot of the thinking and a lot of the scholarship on North Korea happens here in Japan. Yes.
Looking back, maybe over the last, 10 or 20 years, do you think there have been missed opportunities to engage more with North Korea? And one example which I give to people is the time when Kim Jong-un had a party with Disneyland characters. And also, obviously, he connected with Dennis Rodman, the basketball player. And I said at the time, maybe he's sending out signals that he wants to engage with the West, but that seems to have been kind of pulled back a lot in recent years.
Well, I mean, in general terms, I mean, I'm a human rights person, so I look at everything through that angle and how we can use that to improve the lives of people in DPRK and beyond. The history of relations with DPRK on human rights issues is remarkable. The issue between Japan and DPRK on abductees is a great example. I mentioned at the beginning about, as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, what happened over the last 20 years. Engagement, return of abductees, acknowledgement and apology for the enforced disappearances. That hasn't happened in any other case on DPRK. So those opportunities were exploited, and Japan has done better than anyone else in terms of human rights. But it's cyclic, it's sinusoidal, it goes up and down, and we're at a very low point at the moment. But I'd like to come back to what I mentioned earlier about the interests of DPRK as a member state of the United Nations, as a sovereign member state of the United Nations, that it has a deep national interest in its human rights reputation. And this year, we have a number of anniversaries this year, but one of the key ones is the 75 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was signed in 1948, which is a very important year on the peninsula as well. And this is a good opportunity, which the High Commissioner for Human Rights has said is a good opportunity for us to rekindle the spirit of 1948, where member states came together and decided, you know, in order to avoid the scourge of war, we will give these rights. We will recognise these rights. And I hope that that's a good opportunity this year for DPRK and all member states to come together again. I think that's a really good opportunity for engagement. And I think the ground is fertile for it.
You mentioned some litigation in relation to Japanese people. Can you expand on that?
There's a group of individuals who, amongst those who were, as I mentioned, this campaign that took people to DPRK, campaigned by DPRK to take Japanese and others there in the post-war period, well, for quite a while. People seeking accountability against the leadership in DPRK, and they're doing it through the courts here. The first decision was that it was an issue, but that there was a technical reason, and now, as I understand it, it's being appealed. Is that true? Yes, it's being appealed.
Okay. Any questions from the floor? Apparently not. In the long run, one more thing. You mentioned you saw signs of improvements in North Korea. In particular, I was wondering about detention camps. Do you see those expanding or contracting?
Well, I mean, there's a few things to do with detention. One is, whenever you look at a detention issue from a human rights perspective, there's the legal reason you're there, which is a fair trial issue, and we don't see that improving. And then there's the conditions in the camps themselves. We did hear that there was some improvement in the ill treatment issue a few years ago, but I'm not sure that was sustained. I'm just not sure. The actual number of detainees, in terms of whether it's expanding or not, that's something that there is some information that these camps are expanding. Some organisations use satellite imagery to try to track that. It's their work, it's their research. I can't vouch for it, but I would say that some say it is expanding, but I don't have any information on that.
And is there any kind of aid going to North Korea from the West at the moment, Red Cross or?
No.
Or nothing at all?
Well, I mean, from the West, from the international community. No. First of all, there are sanctions. There are UN Security Council sanctions, multilateral sanctions, together with individual country sanctions, which prevent the movement of many materials and technologies and resources to North Korea. In terms of humanitarian aid, there is some coming in, I expect, from neighbouring member states, but it's also the case that DPRK will often reject offers of humanitarian assistance, which are often on a condition, to be fair, but for example, offers from the Republic of Korea have been rebuffed regularly.
Okay. No more questions from the floor. So we're sort of running down the clock here. A broader question. You've been in the job, I think, for 6 months?
6 months, yeah.
So how do you see the office and your own role going forward, and what kind of effect do you think you're going to have or hope to have?
Well, we have a very specific role. We're not a government, we're not an NGO, we're a UN agency. We are mandated by the international community. Member states tell us what to do, they give us our mandates. We will continue to, in situations like this where it feels like there's little movement, the most important thing to do is to continue to document what you can and to keep that securely for the future, which we are continuing to do. And as I said before, a lot of the people we're talking to now escaped maybe 2, 3, 4 years ago. But that's fine. Accountability processes are always about the past. So it's as important what happened 4 or 5, 10 years ago as what's happening now, if there's been no remedy. We have a clear role to lead on this issue of pathways towards accountability, working out what is the most efficient and plausible way to try to bring those responsible for these crimes to account. And as I said before, I think that is effective.
Yeah.
I think we're very public about that. I think you've got a follow-up question.
No, my final question is, it's a kind of unique office that you're in or have in Seoul. It's just dedicated to one small country. Admittedly, it has a lot of human rights issues. Why? I say, why is there a DPRK office and not, say, a China office? Or I could probably name other countries with worse human rights records.
Well, we do have many country offices. I've worked in many countries. Like all parts of the UN, we have country offices. That's not strange. Country offices are generally established, or offices with a focus on a country are generally established where that country has asked you to come, there's an agreement for that country to come, or else there has been some action by the international community saying, open an office in that country. And that's happened in respect of many places. Sudan, South Sudan, Cambodia, many places. And DPRK is one of them. It's just in this case, DPRK has said we totally reject that resolution because it's targeted at us, so therefore we reject it and we won't let you in the country. We still do our work. It doesn't change, but we just can't be in the country.
And if I could just briefly ask you about your work in Israel and Palestine, which presumably had similar, maybe, problems to deal with, or completely different problems to deal with.
Well, there the office was to the occupied Palestinian territory, and it was an office that looked at both human rights violations being committed. It was peculiar because we were dealing with 3 authorities that were involved. There's the Palestinian government, the Israeli state, and the de facto authorities in Gaza, Hamas. So it was a bit peculiar as well. But again, it's the same methodology we use everywhere. There, we interview people. We can actually monitor violations in real time, but we interview people. We follow exactly the same methodology in all these countries. And we publicly report. What's interesting, I guess, is that both Palestine and DPRK are seen to be issues, intractable issues, let me put it that way. Yeah.
Mm. Okay, we just got one final question from Martin Cooling of Handelsblatt.
Thank you, Martin.
What impact does the Korean War and the increasing tensions between US and China have on your work?
Well, that's a good question, because obviously working on DPRK, you are, in human rights, it can't be seen outside the issue of conflict. And that's the case in many cases. Human rights in Palestine can't be seen outside the occupation. Human rights in Syria can't be seen outside the context of the civil war. The issue here is how can the human rights side of the DPRK story be linked to the peace and security and non-proliferation side. The challenge we have is that DPRK has been seen for a very long time as a peace and security issue alone. And that's why the Commission of Inquiry 10 years ago was such an aha moment, because it was as though people said, there's missiles and there's nuclear and so forth, but there's also 50 million people in this country who are having, many of whom are having a hard time in human rights terms. That time, 10 years ago, I would have said that it would be hard to talk about peace and security without talking about human rights. But now the feeling is it's slipped back, that we can talk about human rights and produce all the reports we want on human rights, but as soon as there's a missile fired, that's sort of forgotten and we're back into a peace and security context. Our view is that you can't divorce the two. You can't look at the peace on the peninsula without looking at the human rights situation in DPRK. And that's work in progress. That's work for the future to be done, to link these much more clearly.
Okay, thank you. No more questions. Okay, we will finish here. And before we go, we'd like to give James an honorary membership of the FCCJ so that he has a good place to come and have a drink next time he's here.
Very welcome.
Sure,
thank you very much, Fred. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we're finished. Thank you very much.